Can you not see me?
I can't. No, your video went.
Really?
Yeah, I can't see you.
Okay.
What? Oh wait. Oh, now I can. There we go.
Okay, there we go. Good.
Maybe that's what was slowing it down.
I was like waiting for you to clap, and you were like, "Do it," and I was like, "Yeah, do it. Just fucking do it."
Because I couldn't see.
Yeah.
It was just showing up your icon.
Yeah. Okay, good.
Oh, there we go. Yeah, it was just showing up. It was just showing up your icon, so I couldn't see. So it probably was an awkward moment for you, just sort of hearing me go, "Yes, are we recording? Are we recording?" And you were probably nodding your head.
Welcome. You are entering a strange realm. A realm of what ifs. What if movies, television shows, and video games were better, worse, bizarrer, or downright different? What might they look like? Find out on today's episode of CineCasters.
Hello, and welcome to CineCasters, the show where we watch movies and we deconstruct them and put them back together. And we, in the process, have different thoughts about what we thought was working and wasn't working, and hopefully come up with something that we find more interesting. If not, it's a good excuse to talk about movies and hang out. I am Nate Draper, and I am joined, as always, by my very good friend, Janglez.
Hey, what's up? That was a good intro. I like the deconstructing, but at least we get to talk about movies. It's true. We just like talking about movies. Honestly, these are conversations we'd be having anyway.
Exactly. That was kind of how this whole thing started. We basically went, hey, why don't we just do what we normally do? Just record it and put it on the internet.
And it's a little bit more structured, but we were still like
for the
rewriting
and
movies anyway. We'd be like, you know what would work if we did something
we never
like this
really had any intention like, oh, we need so many. We're shooting for thousands of subscribers. Oh, that certainly would be nice. But it was always more of a, hey, this is fun. Let's just do this thing we always do anyway. Let's just throw some microphones and YouTube into the mix.
YouTube it, yeah. But today we're talking about the actually we've done one of this unofficial trilogy. Do you know about the trilogy?
Yes.
Yeah.
So I know what you're talking about now. Yeah, okay. So is the other one Yes Man?
The other one is Yes Man. So today we're talking about Bruce Almighty.
Is the third one Liar Liar?
It is.
Okay, because I was thinking about that when I was watching it. I was going, oh yeah, there was a time when Jim Carrey was just doing a bunch of movies that were kind of these goofy. It's some kind of supernatural thing happens,
but in like a real world kind of like romantic comedy or sitcom kind of thing. So like it just exactly. There was like a trilogy of them right in a row in the 2000s where we had, I think it was this one first, and then Liar Liar, and then Yes Man. I'd have to double check.
Yeah, exactly. That. Oh, we haven't even. Did I cut you off before you were able to say the title of the movie?
No, you're good. It's Bruce Almighty. We're doing Bruce Almighty.
Bruce Almighty, yeah. Or
which
Bruce
has its own
Almighty.
sequel, it has its own sequel.
Oh yes,
Evan Almighty, which I've not seen. Have you seen it?
Yes, I have. It's not great.
Well, this one's weirdly interesting. I took some weird places with my pitch, as I mentioned last night. So.
I did too.
Places, yeah. So I guess before we get into it, what did you think of Bruce Almighty?
Okay, so I'll jump back a little bit. I saw this. I don't think I saw it in theaters, but I did see it around the time that it came out. I actually watched this on a DVD copy. I had a DVD copy of this lying
like in your house that you watched it?
In my house.
Wow.
I had a DVD. I plopped the DVD into my PlayStation 5. And this was the time when they did DVDs where there was like the full screen edition and the widescreen edition. And I was very disappointed to find that I actually had the full screen edition, which was really annoying because with the full screen edition, what they used to do is they actually used to crop the sides of the frame to make it fit the full screen TV. So I don't know if I was missing, like, because with comedy, sometimes like they'll have things on the side of the screen that'll be little gags, Easter eggs. Yeah. So I don't know if I missed some of that. But anyway, just all that's to say, I'd seen it before when it first came out. And I remember actually really enjoying it when it first came out, like thinking it was really funny. This time, I certainly was able to engage with some of the humor. I mean, I do still find Jim Carrey to be very fun to watch when he's in his element, and I think that there were certainly some moments of that in this. I also really like Morgan Freeman in general, but I also really like him specifically in this movie. I think the way he portrays God is kind of this nonchalant, You know, like he's clearly it's sort of the benevolent God type, but he's kind of nonchalant and doesn't take himself too seriously. And I always liked that portrayal. I thought that was interesting and funny. I did like the 2000 vibes. I was getting some very serious 2000 vibes, which was making me feel nostalgic, and that was fun. Yeah. I also really liked the random Chariots of Fire montage right at the beginning of the movie. It was so unrelated and irrelevant, but it was just the way it was inserted, and it was so over the top.
So funny.
I thought it was so funny. It was so kind of, what was interesting about it is it kind of sets the tone for the movie quite well. Although it's funny because I almost forgot it was there, and looking back, it does kind of, because it's so early in the movie, you kind of expect more of these random intrusions. And I'm upset that they didn't actually happen, because I loved it. Yeah. I thought it was so, I loved it. Other like ideas, like conceptual things. I liked the prayer email thing. Like, oh, okay, God in the 21st century, how's God going to answer prayers? Okay, he's going to he's going to come up with an email
computer,
system that he,
I like the joke there, because for those who don't know, like Yahoo was this old school like browser, and it had that like Yahoo, but instead they did it Yahweh, which is of course one of the various names that God has given in the Bible. I thought that was funny. Like, it's a funny bit.
Yeah, there's a lot of little inside jokes that way. Like, there's a scene where he's at a party and he's going around and he's carrying a little glass of water, and he's pouring it, and it like he pours and it turns into wine right away. So there was like a little moment, or like him and God go for a walk and they're walking on water. So there was like a little subtle references like that were funny.
A lot of the wordplay too that Bruce uses is like a significant amount of it is this like biblical wordplay. Like, a lot of the lines that he drops are like I mean, it's not super clever. Like, it's not like he's dropping particular verses and then, you know, messing with them, but, you know, just sort of classic things. Like, if you're paying attention, you can pick up on you know, just, I mean, and then and he said, like, he thought it was good, or stuff like that, or like, let there be light. Every one of his lines is kind of like some play on like biblical reference. It's funny.
Yeah, exactly. And the other conceptual thing I liked the scene where he goes to meet God for the first time, and God's like, he's a janitor, and then he's doing a light bulb, and then the whole filing cabinet thing. You know, I thought there were some conceptual things there that were funny.
I like the filing cabinet thing because it's a perfect example of Jim Carrey getting to be Jim Carrey with just a little bit of special effects, and it's funny because Morgan Freeman is playing the straight man, but he's in on the joke.
Yeah, exactly. There you go.
And it's funny. It's like that's why it works, is because it's sort of a role reversal. Your funny man is not in on the joke, but your straight man is, and like this leads to this, like, and it's just classic Jim Carrey getting to be like, ah, as he's being flown across the floor by this filing cabinet.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I mean, those were the things I think worked about it. I can get into my relatively longer list of things that I think didn't work, but I'd like to hear kind of what you thought was working first.
I always am a big fan of Jim Carrey. I'm curious as to how this movie gets made, because it is the movie industry as a whole likes to stay away from religion unless it's asking deep questions, or it's Martin Scorsese, because, you know, Scorsese can get away with those deep questions. But otherwise you wind up with movies like God's Not Dead, which one day I will force you to watch because you'll hate it. Or movies like Soul Surfer, which I don't think is a bad movie, but I do think is interesting in how it like portrays Bethany Hamilton's
I think I know who directed that, actually. I haven't seen it.
Yeah, it's not a bad movie. It's just not like it's not what I would consider like one of the greatest movies of all time. I like that movie, but the movie industry is sometimes a little hesitant with how it talks about and its relationship with religion, because you alienate, I think, a lot of your audience if you're going to go into that territory. Rick and Morty makes a whole joke about it, right? At the end of Never Rick and Morty, he makes a joke where he's like, now I believe in God. And he's like, that's kind of a low blow, Rick. Like, it's religious people are like not bad people. And it's true. It's funny because a lot of religious movies are a bit of a cop-out that way. So I do think that's interesting that this movie, and I will say, like, this movie is weirdly religious, kind of cynical towards religion, although not necessarily in the end. I think the message is good in that you don't necessarily have to be Christian in order to get the message, in that I think the message is really just about being grateful and like gratefulness in terms of what you have. And like, yeah, everybody goes through bad luck. So I get that the messaging was good. I do have a problem with how it gets there, and we'll talk about that. But I do think that the fact that this movie is weirdly okay with being like risque while still having like a religious overtone, or not even overtone, like religious like implications. So we wind up with like moments where Bruce is freaking out in front of the television and he just goes like, yeah, you fuckers, and he like straight up just drops the F word. But it's a movie about religion. It's like, it's nice to see them not pulling their punches just because it's a movie about faith in God. And it's funny. There's genuinely some moments in here where it's funny. They show like desire between a man and a woman. He like messes with her breasts at one point in one version, unless you have the cut. Unless you have like the
I did see that. Yeah. That was in the version that I saw. Yeah.
So in the edited version, they don't have that in there. But so like the Clint Eastwood thing where he's like, oh, I feel like I'm Clint Eastwood, and then all of a sudden it's like Jim Carrey playing Clint Eastwood, and he's like, you punk. Those things are funny, and like just a regular person having God's power and messing around with them is hilarious. I do think that there's some inherent logic problems with this movie and its theme, though, which I will get into, and I did talk about in my pitch. But basically, my inherent logic problem is I think the premise of the movie at the end, the theme is still supposed to be that at the end, they're supposed to be like this, I understand, like, what I need to do is be grateful for what I have. But unfortunately, what winds up happening is the way that we get there is because, like, oh, God can handle all this cosmic power and a human can't, so we really should be grateful for what we have and what God provides us. But if you have all of God's powers, then you have the ability to, like, bend time.
Yes.
And space. Yes, you can literally do anything, which means, like, you know, ostensibly you cannot remove God from his power, because then you create a God. The movie is called Bruce Almighty, not Bruce is a God, or not Bruce is a human who has all the powers of God but is still not almighty. If you have the powers of God, then you are essentially a God, that you can do anything. It feels like, if you understand this logic problem, this loophole, then the whole movie falls apart, because the idea is that Bruce is struggling with the almighty power, but you wouldn't.
Yeah, exactly. I had the exact same note. I felt like when the lottery tickets come up, when suddenly there's not enough money for everyone to have winning lotteries, I thought, well, that's an easy solution. He's God. He can just make money out of nowhere, can't he?
Well, like, I mean, then we'd have a problem with, like, technically inflation, but then you could just be like, well, I'm going to create money without it being inflated because I'm God. I can just do that.
Exactly. That's what I mean. It's sort of felt like, well, wait a minute. If he's God and he can do anything, like we just saw him create a car for himself, he's able to manifest things out of nowhere. So global resources shouldn't be an issue because he can just manifest infinite resources now, couldn't he? There did seem to be, there either should have been a further exploration of, okay, wait, are there limits on what God can do? And what would those be? But there really wasn't. So that was another thing that I felt,
then you run into the classic
from a logical
problem.
standpoint. I also took issue with it because I felt like it kind of undermines itself in a way. And of course it's a comedy. It's meant to be, I acknowledge that it's meant to be kind of goofy, but I still felt like the movie could have satisfied some of those questions without losing the goofy, funny side.
Yeah, but then you run into the problem of, like, the classic Epicurean question, right? If God has limitations, then he can't be called God, right? Because
then that would be a question that the movie could explore. Yeah.
So I do think that's interesting, but I don't know that would necessarily be something that a religious filmmaker would want to acquiesce. What I think would be more interesting is like, what if God was like, well, I'm giving Bruce all of my power, but he still has to remain mortal.
Oh, there you go. Oh, that's interesting.
Because just putting a few parameters around there, because, like, I mean, like I said earlier, you can't remove God from his power, because then you essentially just create a new God, because God is almighty. He can do anything, and therefore Bruce can now do anything. So I don't know. I think this movie is interesting in its premise. Like, what if God was one of us? What if this random dude was all of a sudden given all the power, infinite power in the universe? it doesn't fully explore what that means in terms of infinite power of the universe. There's another movie with Simon Pegg that does something very similar, but I can't remember what it's called, where the aliens, who are all played by members of Monty Python, basically are like, we're going to see if this universe, this world that they travel to, is worthy of having is worthy of like staying around, basically. And so they give Simon Pegg's character the ability to like change the universe in any way that he wants by simply waving his hand. And basically, what are the repercussions behind like what would happen to a world where you could basically manifest anything? And I think it's a much more thoughtful movie. It also has Kate Beckinsale in it, I think. It's a much more thoughtful movie, but it's a very similar premise in terms of how the movie interacts with the idea of having almighty power and how that might affect other people. Now, in this movie, Bruce isn't allowed to like tell other people that he's God, whereas in the Monty Python movie he is allowed to tell other people. And what winds up happening is Kate Beckinsale's character basically says, I can't be with you, like, because I don't know, like, if the way that I feel about you, they don't worry about free will in this movie, but I can't be with you because the way that I feel about you could just be because you've manifested it, you've made it happen. And so she's like, I can't trust even my own feelings, which is interesting. Like it's much more logical in terms of how it outlines its premise, but it's a very similar premise.
Yeah, I so in terms of, touching on that free will thing, I felt like the movie also contradicted itself a little bit concerning free will, mostly
what
because
is free will?
Like for example, well, exactly, because there are certain cases where he does seem to actually be directly manipulating people. There's the scene with Evan, with the anchor man who takes his job, played by Steve Carell, and he basically starts putting words in his mouth. Well, is that not a manipulation of free will?
Yeah, exactly.
Or it like so, and then there's the question of like, okay, well, if you set up certain parameters and a person chooses to do a certain thing, do they have free will? Now, obviously, that's maybe getting more into depth with the question than is necessary for a movie like this. But then there's the scene where him and Jennifer Aniston, they're about to make love, and he's doing all these things, and he's certainly manipulating her in a way. Yeah. So is that also like, isn't that also kind of a compromising free will? So I think the movie kind of, it says, no, you can't manipulate free will. But then also the thing that was interesting about that is usually if you introduce a rule like that, it's because it can be broken. But in this case, it couldn't actually be broken. It was sort of a strange non sequitur. It felt like to me, like he says, you can't mess with free will, but he couldn't anyway. Like he tried, but then he couldn't. It's sort of strange to me, like the way that it sets up like how to mess with free will, like the way he, like, if he's pulling the moon in and like forcing her to feel desire and like setting the stage, is that not messing with free will? Even though he's messing with it in very mortal ways, like the way anybody would, he's using his godlike abilities to pull the moon in to make her feel at least a physical emotion. That's manipulating free will, right? Now, that's manipulating free will in a way that is similar to how like setting the mood as a mortal would be the same thing, but it's still a manipulation of free will. So like, where's the line? Is he just not allowed to use his power to do that, or is he allowed to use his power to like manipulate the environment, which can then affect free will? I think again, I think the problem here is that the movie just is not clear about what they mean when he says use power to affect free will. I think the idea was that he just couldn't like change people's minds about something. Because that sets up the conflict. That sets up the conflict with Jennifer Aniston, with Grace, because he can't just change her mind into having her believe that they're in love. He can't do that, right? Because that's free will. Well, because there is the scene where he goes to like, Grace is like walking away from him and he goes, love me, but then nothing happens. And so I just sort of thought it was weird because Morgan Freeman, God, tells him basically like, you can't, you don't mess with free will. The implication there being like he has the ability to do it, but then when it comes down to actually trying it, it's something he physically can't do. So it's sort of strange that they would present that rule only for it to not even be possibly broken in the context of this universe.
That's a whole different movie, and I find that interesting. Like, what if the rule is he's not supposed to mess with free will, like God's not supposed to do that, but he has the ability to? Because that's much more like a moral implication. Like, what if you have all the power of God? Yeah. But then if you have all the power of God, I mean, it's the same thing as the movie that I was talking about with Simon Pegg. Like, if you have all the power of God, how do you stop from manipulating other people, right? Is it moral? Is it to do so? You know what I mean? Then Bruce has to ask questions of like, you know, if he can do these things just because he can, should he? That's a much more ethical question. If you have all the power in the world, you still have to wield it with some degree of ethics, right?
Yeah, but I just feel from like a film, like a screenwriting perspective, it's one thing that would stand out to me if I'm reading a script and you're introducing the rules to your universe, and you say to a character, "Do not break this rule." I am of the opinion that at a certain point in your story, that rule has to be broken.
That's Chekhov's gun, right?
Exactly. This was kind of like a Chekhov's gun that was hinted at, but then they go to fire it and they can't do anything with it. So it was kind of this, like I said, it was a strange non sequitur where it was like flagged, like, hey, pay attention to this. This is going to come up again. But then there's no real implications that are explored from that. Nothing actually happens, which is why I felt like you could have it could have been done away with.
Yeah.
And it wouldn't have really changed. Like it's clearly meant to imply that, free will is important. Yeah. That's why it's there. But in terms of how it's actually incorporated into the story, it lost some of its weight, in my opinion, because he couldn't actually do anything about it in the end.
Yeah. And there was never any like rule breaking that caused him to like give up his power or change something, you know, like some kind of repercussion because he broke the rule. No, that's very interesting. What I'm also curious about is, I think what it would have been interesting as well is this movie is almost like a monodrama, in that it's really only about Bruce. He's the only one who has any sort of arc. He's the only one that we pay attention to. He's the only one that has any kind of character growth, or even really all that much character at all, because all of the other characters are like very, very much bit parts. Like God is God, and that's fine. But like, especially Grace, she's our secondary character, and she is like basically only used as like bait for Bruce. She's basically only used as bait for Bruce. Like there's no, she doesn't really have an arc. All she is something to dangle in front of him. And all the characters are like that. Like Evan is the rival at work, and then Susan is this like desirable other woman that comes into to Bruce's life. But I just felt like there was not a lot of agency from anybody other than Bruce. So just on the topic of free will, as when you're talking about free will, you often think about autonomous characters, but I didn't really feel like the characters were very autonomous anyway.
Yeah, that's actually a good point. And that's something else that I felt like really kind of took the movie back. I felt like, there's a few other things about the movie that jumped out at me. One was in terms of the setup. I felt like one of the reasons why the movie didn't work for me so much was because, to me, it kind of just plays like one entitled white man's emotional breakdown, and he just learns to be less selfish at the end. And somehow having God's powers didn't really seem like it was a necessary step for him to get there. Yeah. Also, if you're exploring like, to me, it's just if you're gonna ask the question of like, well, why am I suffering? Why is there suffering in the world? To get to that point, there needs to be something else that's going on. So this is where I felt was missing was this sort of sense of injustice we feel at the beginning, like, oh God, why are you doing this to me? Came across more as just whining, because we can see very clearly that everything that happens to him, the reason he's suffering is because of his own choice. Yes. He is being an idiot, and he's being a jerk.
So this is why I think about the theme of being grateful, which I do think is a good theme, but I think it falls flat because there's no real sense. I mean, it's all his fault, but then there's no real point in having God in there at all. Like, then it's not really about the theme of gratefulness. It's more about like, is God actually causing this, or is this just Bruce being an entitled, white man who keeps fucking up his own life and then blaming somebody else for it? Exactly. And so I felt like for it to really, for the whole complication to really arise, where he's going, God, why are you doing this to me? The suffering that he experiences needed to seem arbitrary and needed to seem like it was out of his control. Then you could say like, oh, he's being punished and we don't know why. It's
bad things are happening to him and we don't know why. And then he would be right to go like, why is this happening to me? Whereas in the way it's presented, it's like, why is this happening to me? And I immediately go, well, you were a jerk to your girlfriend. You were a jerk to that person you interviewed, like when you didn't need to be. Like, you've actually brought this on yourself.
Yeah.
So I think if in terms of asking those questions of like, why is there, to me, seemed like it was trying to ask the question of like, why is there arbitrary suffering? But he wasn't suffering arbitrarily. It was clearly his own fault.
It was clearly of his own making. He's like not, and that's why I come back to this idea of gratefulness. He's not grateful for what he has, and he keeps taking it for granted, and this leads to him causing his own suffering. The issue is that you don't need God for that. It's not clear that
exactly.
this is, it's clearly on screen, it's clearly causal in terms of what's causing the bad things to happen, as opposed to like unexplained until we actually like have God show up. I actually wonder how much of this movie was influenced by Groundhog Day.
Interesting.
Like, do you see what I mean?
See
like,
that actually. Yeah. Like he's being a jerk, and now, right.
A lot of this to me seems like, what if somebody was being like, hey, like, instead of like existential hell of the eternal recurrence in terms of like Nietzschean ideals, what if it was like, hey, you know, Nietzsche is bad because God isn't dead, and people are like, we need to have like a religious version of Groundhog Day, except the premise is slightly different, and we'll have another comedian do it. Like, I feel like somebody out there was like, let's do Groundhog Day but for religion. Christianity.
Right. Yeah. Well, okay. It certainly does have that tone to it, and I think that was kind of my other issue with it. It makes a lot of assumptions about.
Yeah, but anything to do with faith is going to make a lot of assumptions.
Of course it does, but I still feel like there are some basic things that the character didn't ask or didn't go like, oh, wait a minute, like. I was right. There's a God, because there's somewhere in there the part that I was watching it and I went, wait, he's religious all of a sudden. Like, he didn't seem to be particularly interested in it.
Yeah,
and then suddenly she's like, here, have these prayer beads. Okay. And now he's like praying like he's done it before. And I was sort of, and now God shows up. And so I feel like if that was me in that situation, I'd go, holy shit. Like, this is actually, like, you're actually a real person? Oh, okay. Well, that, like, oh, so one of these religions was actually right and the rest of them were wrong? There's like there's an episode of South Park where they're all in hell.
Oh, precisely, yeah.
And they're like, so it turns out the Mormons were right.
The Mormons were correct.
And that's why you're all here. But playing with this idea that, like, okay, well, if you're going to introduce this, well, now what? Like, what implications does this have? This means that one religion was right and the rest were wrong. Okay, well, how does a character like make sense of that? There's another thing that was
that's a whole other thing. Yeah, that you almost honestly didn't even need to give Bruce any godlike abilities. Just go like, hey, yeah, I'm real. Like, I'm here. Yeah. What does that say about how the universe functions and your place in it? Like, I'm a real person. Exactly. I'm a real being. That's a whole different movie that probably might have asked some deeper questions. Because, like, certainly remember, one of the rules was that he couldn't tell other people that he had God's powers. But that doesn't mean he couldn't tell people that God was real. Now, people might be like, oh, you're nuts. But then he could go to Grace and be like, nah, man, I met God. Nice guy. But he's 100% real. Yeah, exactly. And, like, how would people react to that? Like, I mean, that's basically like a prophet movie, right? Yeah. He's nuts, but we know he's met God.
But then he has the ability to answer prayers, and he's like, look, I know
oh, yeah,
God will answer this prayer. Like, he could say, but I know God's going to answer this prayer for you,
and then he could just answer it. Yeah,
he just can't tell people. Give people some kind of faith through indirectly. You're right.
Yeah. So no, I think that's a really interesting.
There was some other issues. Oh, go ahead.
I was just gonna say we talked about a little bit about the newscaster scene when he like makes Evan like talk really, really weird, and I sent you that meme of the guitar gent thing, because he's like talking in all those voices, and then somebody on YouTube did like the gent thing, like to make it sound like this terrible sort of breakdown in a gent song and a guitar song. Like, I thought, I sent that to you because I always think that's super funny because the rhythm is there. Yeah. Anal dwelling butt monkey. I think that's just a hilarious line. It's just, oh, hello there, anal dwelling butt monkey. Time for you to go home. Yeah. Like there's a bunch of good gags in here. Oh, also Morgan Freeman.
Yeah,
looks,
for sure.
Yeah, Morgan Freeman looks really good in a white suit. Like, poof.
He can pull
parting
it off.
the Red
yeah.
Sea when he parts the Red Sea, but
That
it's
was
in tomato
awesome.
soup.
The soup,
It's such a
parting
good
the red
bit.
soup.
Yeah.
That was funny. I appreciated that too. Yeah.
There's some really, really funny like little bits of humor in it's just fantastic. I really enjoy the humor in the movie. So yeah, I really did enjoy the humor. But should we get into some pitches, or do you have anything else that you wanna?
Yes, I had a few other things. I was the one thing that kind of I was a little upset by was like the only time we see any Latino people in this movie is when they're like gangsters.
Yeah,
and and I thought that was like, yeah, like there was nothing. That was the only time we see, and like,
oh no, I think Susan is supposed to
only...
be Hispanic because her last name is Ortega. So and the way she pronounces it, she
you
does
might be
roll
right.
the
You might be
R,
right.
So, but I'm not certain
you might
that
be right.
The actress was necessarily Hispanic, but that's not to say that they didn't attempt. But I think the big thing for this movie was to have Morgan Freeman as God. I think a lot of people would be like, oh, God is black.
So that was something I liked. Yeah, I like we said. I like Morgan Freeman. So yeah. What was that? Let's see. There was another way to do. I also find, okay, this is just a general note about Jim Carrey. I think his greatest strength is also his greatest weakness. His greatest strength is that he can be really over the top and it can be really funny and really animated. But I also believe that in cases where he's supposed to be more sincere, especially towards the end, when there's meant to be this more like he's actually had some transformation. Yeah, I just don't believe it. I still feel like
I have the same problem with the Grinch.
Lying through his teeth. Yeah.
In the live action Grinch, he's like, he has this whole heart like changing thing, and I'm like, first of all, I don't want the Grinch to change his personality and become, because I just think he's better when he's an asshole. He just is, but. Yeah, I just I totally agree with you. Like, it just feels undercut because he's got this like I don't want to even say overacting, but this over the topness about him, and it just doesn't come across well when he has to do those emotional scenes. When he's acting like this, because there are other movies like in The Truman Show, I think when he's playing a more serious role, you can see like it lands because he doesn't have to try and balance this comedic overarching acting thing with the emotional climax and impact of the movie, because he can simply focus on making sure that there's only that one sound, right? Not one sound. What am I trying to say? Make sure that like there's not two different things. So I'm just thinking of like other movies where he plays more serious roles. I can't think of any off the top of my head. And the Cable
Eternal
Man
Sunshine of the
count.
Spotless Mind.
Yeah, that one, because he's not overacting, right? So there's like a place where it like lands that makes it work, because he doesn't have to balance the comedy with the action. I just think that tends to work a little bit better for him. It's hard. It's a hard thing to pull off. It's not just him. It's a hard thing to try and pull off. How well can you be comedic and serious? And some actors can do it, but they might be able to do it because they're not quite so physical. A lot of Jim Carrey's comedy is very physical.
Yeah. Well, where I think he does it well. So I'm glad you brought up Truman Show, because I think that insincerity I'm talking about works there, because the whole thing is like he doesn't realize it, but he's living in a very manufactured, constructed life. So in the context of the Truman Show, that what I'm talking about, that insincerity, it works a little bit more because it complements the style and it complements the content of this world where everything is superficial. And so even if his performance is a little bit superficial, but it works because everything around him is fake.
Yeah, I can sort of see that. I don't see his performance as too superficial or insincere in that case. I certainly see it like at the end when he takes the bow, it almost feels like the whole thing has been a stage production, so that there's like another layer of artifice being removed. But like in Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind, he's pretty serious, and I think the emotional impact lands.
No, I think that's definitely one where he's it's very different. It's a very different tone for him, and I think he's excellent in that. And the same, I was gonna say the same thing goes for Man on the Moon, because in Man on the Moon, it's the same. That strength works towards his advantage because that character that he's playing, you don't know if he's joking or being serious.
Yeah,
and so that complements the character he's playing.
Or
Whereas
same with what is it in the Cable Man.
I haven't seen that. Yeah.
Oh, it's a horror movie where like Jim Carrey winds up,
okay.
or like a thriller at least, where Jim Carrey winds up being the bad guy, and he's like chasing them, and he's humming the theme song that's playing while he's chasing them. So there's almost this like case where he's like breaking the fourth wall by humming this song as he chases the protagonist along, and so it almost works because there's this insincerity where he's drawing back the curtain, like how much of this is just him playing the movie against the audience, right, as the villain. Like,
right.
it's weird.
Yeah.
Yeah. I will also. What did you think? Because we've already done it. What did you think of Yes Man in terms of his overacting? I know it's been almost 2 years since we did that movie.
Yeah, I probably had a similar response. I mean, yeah, because it's it's in cases where, specifically at the end of this movie, where it's supposed to be that he's had some genuine transformation. I found in this case I didn't believe it because it seemed like he was still kind of putting on a character, and I recall feeling that way in Yes Man. I honestly don't remember, and I'm not trying to say that Jim Carrey is
super memorable. Like, I mean, it's an okay movie, and it was an interesting concept, but it wasn't super memorable in terms of like, all I remember is Zooey Deschanel and Jim Carrey playing opposite each other, and I felt like he was more like less of that physical comedy in Yes Man, which may have made it seem more sincere, but it's still like he still gets away with his like comedic timing and whatnot, which does have an impact on like the sincerity of that movie. So
yeah. I'm thinking of like, there's like, okay, I'll go to Charlie Chaplin. Like he, like in some of his movies, like he's able to balance that, that visual slapstick humor, and then has these moments where it's quite sincere, and quite believable. Whereas in the case, and Jim Carrey can do that. Like he definitely can. Like we talked about Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind. Like definitely.
But I think it's harder when you have to carry two different formats, like when you have to carry that physical comedy and then you have to try and carry the emotional climax of the movie. That's what I was saying earlier. I think the reason Charlie Chaplin may be able to get away with that is because there's not a lot of, like, at least to my knowledge, not all of Charlie Chaplin's movies have like a spoken word element, so you sort of rely on how well he acts out those two different things. And so I wonder actually if that maybe makes it easier. Like if you remove one element, whether that's the physical comedy or the dialogue, you actually make it easier on yourself to balance an emotional scene versus the comedy of it.
Yeah, I mean that's a good point. I mean, I think in the case of something like The Great Dictator, for example. I mean, it is a little like, you could say it's a little over sentimental at the end. He's giving this very big speech at the end. But I'm thinking specifically of a movie like City Lights, where it's quite, there's a lot of slapstick scenes in it, but at the very end, it's this very emotional sort of recognition, and it's all visual. And I think it helps also too. It's a silent movie, so it's the way in which, and he's directing it as well, so he's able to, I think, play to his strengths in that sense.
Yeah.
But yeah, all that's to say, in this specific case, where I felt like the ending of this movie, Bruce Almighty, didn't work as well, I just found that it's the way Jim Carrey, from the way he delivers his lines and the way he conducts himself on screen, it still feels insincere.
But I wonder maybe if that was even the point on top of it. I'm not saying that this was actually
possible.
the point, but from an atheist perspective, all of a sudden you go, well, hang on a second. If he's not sincere about this entire movie, then maybe it's a farce about what would happen, and he's being entirely, like, the entire thing, if you read it, want to read it that way, is basically being like, hey, this is just like a funny movie about the nonsensical way that we perceive God's power. If you want to read it as a really cynical reading with Jim Carrey in on the joke.
another really cynical reading was you could interpret this movie as this is how ignorant people in power abuse their power, get away with it, and other people suffer for it. So like, for example, he lassos the moon so he can have this romantic evening. Well, it causes a tidal wave. He doesn't even bother. He doesn't even know about it.
Yeah.
His Grace, she's watching it on TV. She finds out about it. She doesn't know.
Yeah.
But Bruce doesn't know about it either, doesn't do anything about it. And all of his efforts to try and make his life better, it just creates more problems. And in the end, they're kind of swept under the rug and he's able to get on with his life. So you could interpret the movie that way if you were going to be more generous with it.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that, I mean, I think that I don't think this movie is particularly smart, but I think there are some like concepts in here that are fun to talk about, like to pull apart.
Oh, yeah.
Which makes me think that I think we should get into pitches. How does your pitch look?
My pitch is I'll go first.
Okay. You were kind of excited. You said you might change some things.
Yeah, I started, I wasn't able to spend as much time with it as I maybe should have. In the end, I mean, I it was one of those cases where I think I had, as I was watching it, I was thinking about it and going like, oh yeah, this is what I'll do. And I sat down to write it out and I went, oh, it's maybe not quite as bullet tight as I thought it was.
Yeah.
I was essentially, where I start was with the, there's a Roger Waters song. I think it's called Lay Down Jerusalem, or but the chorus is, if I had been God, I think I could have done a better job.
Yeah.
And so I kind of felt like that was sort of,
you better not take off my pitch, because I swear to God, I'm gonna be mad if your pitch is my pitch.
Okay, well, I'll go for it, and hopefully it's not. So I start off with the scene that's like It's a Wonderful Life. You know how it's in It's a Wonderful Life, you have the stars, and they're like talking to each other, and they're like, oh, there's George down there, and oh, you've got to go help him, and there's like this heaven, like this celestial chorus playing in the background. Well, it's that, but it's God and it's the devil. and it's like the beginning of the book of Job, if you're familiar with the book of Job. It's the devil comes to God and is like, hey, that guy Job, I'm going to go mess with him, and he's not going to care much for you at the end. And God's like, they basically make a bet that Job's going to still like God at the end of it. And so in this one, it's the devil coming to God, and he's like, hey, that guy Bruce. And in my version, like, Bruce is a very committed, like from the beginning, very definitively believes in God. And so the devil's like, hey, that guy Bruce, I think, I actually think that if you took all these things away from him, he wouldn't believe in you anymore. And God's like, no. Like, I'm not going to do that. But then he goes, but you know what? You've given me an idea. He doesn't say it. That's where the scene ends. So then we go to Bruce, and he's working as a reporter in Buffalo, and basically, he's just constantly having bad luck. So it's like he's like on the way to record this one story that's like gonna break his career, and his car breaks down, and he's not able to get it fixed, and he's late, and someone else records the story for him. Like Grace breaks up with him, and he's trying to get he's trying to get a job at like a bigger station. So he's going from one station to another, and he has all his tapes at home. And the day before he's going to go in for the interview, there's like a big flood at his apartment, and all his tapes are destroyed. And so it's like all these things that happen. The idea is like just pile on all these bad things happening to him that he has no control over. So this is what leads him to having that breakdown where he goes like, God, like, come on, like, why are you doing this to me? Anyway, so he's like, his apartment is flooded. He's all alone. It's the same thing with the pager. Like, it's the same, like 555-0123. He calls it.
Is that a biblical reference? I'm
not sure. Well, 5. Okay, so 5, if I'm understand correctly, there is some significance to 5, because 5 is, it's like your all the fingers on your hand. There's some like, I believe it has significance for like completeness. 3 is an important number because it's the Trinity. I'm not sure what the 0. I'm not sure if there is.
Okay, I was just wondering because like I wonder how much like numerology plays into like religious thematics.
Well, the 7 when he goes to the building and it's on floor 7. 7 is a significant number. The 7 reoccurs throughout the Bible multiple
and
times.
throughout this movie too. Yeah.
And throughout this movie too, exactly. And then even like when you meet God, there's like he appears 3 times. Like I guess that's how I always interpreted it. Like he appears first as like this janitor, and then he appears as this electrician.
Damn, you went
and then
deep.
he appears as the boss. Yeah, so there's clearly some layers there, which I think is interesting. Yeah. But so it's the same case in this. He gets the call. He goes and visits God, and God basically tells him up front that he's going on vacation, and that Bruce is going to take his job. And it's the same thing. He can't mess with free will, and basically, but he frames it like this: like, look, Bruce, now like you've seen I know you've been complaining for a long time that like bad things are happening. Like, why do bad things happen to good people? Well, now's your chance. You can make the world a better place. Go to town. I'm gonna be away for a couple weeks. Call if you need anything. Bye. And then he like disappears.
Damn.
So
God's
Bruce basically he goes about like he starts off by like trying to like get his apartment in order, and then he looks out the window and he sees a homeless person, so he's like, you know what, I'm just going to give that guy lots of money. And so that guy like suddenly like he opens up the suitcase and there's like a lot of cash in there. And then Bruce is like, well, hey, wait a minute. Like, I can solve all these problems. There's like a drought happening on the other side of the world. So he like makes it rain and it solves this drought. He makes climate change just go away.
Yeah.
So he starts making the world a better place. And there's all these people who are sick, like who have cancer. He just heals all of them. They just all of them miraculously heal. And so a lot of people around the world are starting to go like what's going on? Like there are some people who, depending on whatever their religious tradition is, they're all like, oh wow, like our, God looking after us. But he still feels sad inside because Grace left him and he doesn't know how to get her back.
Yeah.
Anyway, what he finds is that even though things have gotten better, there's still problems. And what happens very shortly afterwards, that homeless man that he gave a lot of money to made some very smart investments, now has a big major business and is now like exploiting people and taking advantage of people as part of this big corporation that he owns. And because he got rid of climate change, now companies aren't like, there's no disincentive. Like it's the incentives are actually to just extract more oil. So now companies are extracting even more resources. So Bruce is going, okay, well, wait a minute. That's not quite what I had hoped. So maybe I'll just make infinite resources. So he does that. But that just exacerbates it. Now these companies are just like exploiting more people and
not telling people that there's infinite resources.
Exactly.
That's how they make. Yeah.
So it's essentially this case where he keeps trying to fix things and it just creates different problems. So there was a problem with like animals were being like hunted to extinction. So he just makes animals, basically like he makes an abundance of animals. Well, now that there's so many animals, there's just no reason to stop hunting. So hunting like kicks up into like insane high gear. So he makes animals faster and stronger, but then the animals start fighting back.
They're like killing humans.
He's like, He's like, okay, well, wait a minute. This isn't good. So he tries to dial that back. Anyway, basically he's trying to balance all these things and he's finding that it's like hard to get the world in like the right equilibrium. Anyway, at this point, the devil shows up and he's like, hey, you know what? I see you're trying all these things and I see you're trying to make the world a better place and, good for you. But, I think the problem is people, like, no matter what you do, they're just going to keep messing things up. Have you considered just, making them different? And Bruce goes, well, that would be playing with their free will. I'm not technically supposed to do that. And the devil goes, yeah, but if you're God and you can do anything, shouldn't you be able to do whatever you want? Shouldn't you be able to manipulate people's free will? Like who said that you can't do that? Well, God said that, but if you're God, you make the rules, right? And basically Bruce gets so tired of debating with the devil. He goes, well, wait a minute. Didn't God create you? And the devil goes, yeah. And then Bruce goes, well,
I don't like where this is going.
Bruce goes, well, hey, wait a minute. God didn't say I couldn't just uncreate something. He just said I can't mess with free will. So I'm just going to get rid of you. And he just uncreates the devil.
That's amazing.
but despite this, he's like, aha, I figured it out. The devil doesn't exist anymore. People are going to be good. But they're not. They're still jerks.
Yeah.
And they're still exploiting the planet. And finally, so he keeps tweaking it, and finally he gets everything in balance. He's like, yes, I've got it all sorted out. Like everyone is happy. Everything is perfect. But in this perfect world he's created, Grace ends up with somebody else. And he gets married. And so even though he's like made everything great, he still feels like, like it's still not working out for him. Anyway, at this point, God shows up and God goes, what did you do? And Bruce is like, oh, I fixed everything. You said I should make the world a better place. And I did. I went to town, and God says, you weren't actually supposed to make the world a better place. And we flash back to the beginning, to the rest of the conversation. And basically in it, the devil's like, the devil just starts making fun of God and is like, yeah, like this thing you created, this planet is a real joke. Like, it's terrible. Like it doesn't work the way you planned it to work. It's awful. You should just get rid of it. And God's basically like, look, okay, tell you what, I'm going to pick anybody. I'm going to pick someone, and I'll show you that like nobody can do a better job at this than I can. And if someone does a better job at this than me, then I'll quit. I'll walk away. And he basically picks Bruce to take his job. But what he then admits is like, Bruce is like, oh, so you picked me randomly? God's like, actually, no, I made it look like I picked you randomly. But the thing is, you are so incompetent and so bad at your job. I thought that you would actually mess it up. I'm actually surprised you did a better job. So I lost my bet. And then Bruce goes, oh, don't worry about that. I uncreated the devil. You don't have to worry about that. And God goes, oh, I never thought of that. What a great idea. And so everything
is actually
on Earth,
super funny.
Everything on Earth seems great now, but Bruce is still unhappy. In fact, even though he's sort of shortly established some kind of equilibrium, things start descending into chaos again.
Okay.
Because God takes his old position back. God, and basically Bruce goes back and he's like, "Hey, God, like what's going on?" And God's like, "Okay, look, Bruce, let me explain it to you. This has always been a problem. I've tried many times, and every time I try to get the world in balance, it just doesn't work out. Like people just keep fucking it up, and I don't know. And the only way around it is to mess with free will, but I can't." And Bruce goes, "Well, why can't you just like you made everything, you made us all, like, so all these problems, can't you just make us so that we get along and that we'd be happy?" And God goes, "I actually can't." And Bruce goes, well, so there's a limit to your power. And God basically says, "Well, sort of." "Well, what do you mean sort of?" God says, "Well, I made a promise very early on to Adam that I wouldn't mess with his ability to make his own choices, and I have to keep my word." And Bruce is like, "So wait, you're saying that if you say something you physically can't?" And God's basically just like, no, I just think it's good practice that if you say something, you should stick to it.
Yeah.
And Bruce is like, "Okay, so you could technically make it so that everybody gets along and everyone's happy, and you could mess with their free will to do so." And God's like, "Yeah, I could, but I feel like I want to be a man of my word, and I feel like I'd be going back on that, and I don't really want to do that." And Bruce is, and so basically they engage in this back and forth where Bruce is asking him like, "Well, why can't you do it this way?" And God's like, "Nah, I can't do that." Like, "Well, why not?" "Well, because I told Noah, like thousands of years ago that I wouldn't bring a flood to wipe people out again, because, and so I just want to keep up with, I said I'd do that, so I'm going to stick to my word." And then eventually God has this idea. Basically, God eventually is like, "You know what, Bruce? I've been thinking when I was on vacation. So I went and I did a lot of soul searching, and I went and talked to my therapist." And Bruce is like, "Wait, you have a therapist?" And God's like, Yeah. No, it's a long story.
It's a long story. That's amazing.
But my therapist is like, and my therapist is in agreement. This job just isn't good for me. So. Yeah, I think, you remember like before I gave you my job, how you were saying that I wasn't doing very good, and I wasn't cut out for this and that you thought you'd do better. Well, I'm actually starting to think that you're right. I don't think I'm cut out for this whole God thing. And I think I should start over. And Bruce is like, wait, what do you mean? God's like, well, remember how I said I promised Noah I wouldn't do a flood? Well, I said I wouldn't do a flood to wipe out humankind, but maybe I was thinking like maybe a plague or something like that. Like, I just got to get rid of, I just got to figure out a way to start over. And God's like, you know what? That's what I'm going to do. And he just snaps his fingers. And Bruce is like, wait, you're just going to wipe out humanity? And then basically, and then God says, like, yeah, he's like, yeah, I created all of the earth. I created everyone because I felt like something was missing in my life. I was kind of alone in this void, and I wanted someone who would be like me. And I thought, wow, a whole planet that would be like me, But this whole planet is I just feel like I'm babysitting, and everybody just asks me for things all the time. And, all of my attempts to make it better, I just keep making it worse. So yeah, I think it's better to just cut your losses, and I'm just going to go make another universe. So, it's been fun. It's been fun, Bruce. And then Bruce is like, but wait, I thought you're God. Like, I thought God loved us. Like, I thought you were supposed to be benevolent. And God's like, oh, come on, Bruce. You don't really believe that. Like, your religion. Okay, Bruce, your religion's been around for like 2,000 years. There are other religions that were around like thousands of years before that. Do you really think yours is the one that's like the most accurate? Like, I've always admired your naivety, Bruce. Anyway, it's been nice knowing you. He snaps his finger, and then that's the end of the movie.
Oh my God, that's so good. Yo, I love how like your movie is so irreverent. Like it just doesn't, like, God doesn't give a fuck about anything. It's so funny. And I just love the idea of Bruce being like, oh, you're the devil, I'm just gonna unmake you. He's going. I love that. Yeah. Oh man, that's funny. Oh, mine is very, very similar, actually. So,
okay.
So, yeah, maybe not quite as funny, but yeah, I do. So my movie opens out with Bruce, who's covering a feel-good story about a charity. When all of a sudden, so basically, this charity was designed to have this rec center was supposed to be in a part of Buffalo City that was kind of underprivileged. And so Bruce is like, oh, okay, I'm going to cover how this rec facility is being opened up, and it's been opened by this charity. And all of a sudden what winds up happening is mid-story, it winds up happening that the construction workers can't start working on the rec center because the money that they were supposed to use has been embezzled. So they can't start working on the rec center because the money's been embezzled. So the organization is actually like fucked over the entire rec center. And Bruce is horrified. He's like, oh my goodness, I can't believe this is happening. But he's also a reporter, and he's the reporter on site. And he's ready to cover the story about how all the money's been gone, and after all the charity work from the whole, community, and the money's all gone. But then Evan shows up, and a producer says they want Evan to cover the story because he's known as a more serious reporter for the audiences, whereas Bruce does the feel-good stuff, and they just want to make sure. And Bruce is like, but, I'm a news reporter. Like, I was trying to gun for the anchor position. And then most of this part of the movie would work out the same way, except a lot of the things that happen are the same kind of things that happen in your movie, like a flood and just bad things that are happening because they there's no causal, at least no apparent causal effect. And Bruce lives with Grace, who's very, very religious. And he's like, the world seems against him. But Grace reminds him that he should be grateful for what he has. And he, of course, he calms down. He's like, I am grateful that you support me. Don't think that I don't. And I just feel as though the world is not working in my favor right now. And so the next day, Bruce doesn't get the anchor job and is at Niagara Falls, and he finds out that he doesn't have the anchor job. And at that same moment, the Maid of the Mist malfunctions, and he doesn't even have a story. And he just loses it on air. He's just like, how? The world is such an unfair place. So then he gets fired. He goes home to Grace, and Grace tries to cheer him up by saying, hey, God works in mysterious ways. And Bruce is she's like, you just need to listen and be patient and open to the path that God has laid before you. And Bruce is like, look, Grace, I'm starting to think that I don't really want to believe in God anymore. It just seems like that there's world is much more arbitrary and full of like bad things that I just can't believe that there's a God that would allow this kind of stuff to happen. And Grace is like, I can't hear this. Like, I can't hear this anymore. I think you should spend some time apart from me. So Bruce is like, okay, I'm gonna head out, and he goes for a drive. And along the way, he sees lots of signs. Like he's like, okay, I'll try. I'm gonna try praying and see what happens. And he sees lots of signs, and he clearly goes the wrong way, and his car gets destroyed. And we can see he's going the wrong way in life. The next morning, he gets beepered by the office, and he meets the actual God. And he's like, oh, whoopsie, I guess you totally exist. And God is like, yeah, I'm an actual person. And you know what? My job's not easy, Bruce. And Bruce is like, well, what the heck, man? How come everything's... And he's like, you know what? You try it. And he just like hands over the power of God to Bruce. And Bruce is like, crap, now I got to do God's job and try and like get my life back together.
Right.
So Bruce becomes God, and he's freaking out. And most of this part of the movie happens the same way as Bruce tries like to fix his own life. He apologizes to Grace, and he's like, I definitely come around to like this whole God thing. And then when prayer happens, he organizes them, and eventually, like in the original movie, shit starts to like break down, and it's like the world's ending. And Bruce has to like reckon with his own life choices versus like what's happening in the movie, or what's happening like with his idea of being God. And Grace has left him by this point, but he sits down with her and he asks why she continues to believe even when shit in the world is so terrible. And she's like, well, like all this bad stuff that's happening in your life, like if you get hurt or get sick, like you could reconcile that. And she's like, yeah. She basically tells to Bruce, like, she's like, it's got to be tough for God, like, you know, like, but he can do anything. Like, there's nothing that he can't do. And Bruce is like, oh shit, yeah, he can do anything. He can literally just do anything. And so Bruce starts to change how his own time and space work around him so that he can accomplish all his goals, because he can just do that. And so he really starts to spend time. He's in the beginning, he's just like, I'm just going to listen to what people say when they pray, because I have infinite time now. So he just listens in the beginning, and then slowly he starts to help people in small ways, and then bigger and bigger. And he finds like he also has a sense of like self-gratification in helping others, and this leads him back to Grace once again. He's like, I understand what... And so like God shows up and is like, so I hope you learned your lesson, how hard my job is. And Bruce is like, well, yes, but also kind of no. I was trying to do everything as a human, and you're not human. And since you gave me all your abilities, I stopped thinking about the confines of my own humanity and started looking at things outside of time and space. And God is like, well, you can't just do anything you want. There's a plan. And he's like, you have to follow the plan. Right. And Bruce is like, okay, how do I follow the plan? So he manifests this plan as like a blueprint, like a literal city blueprint. Right. And he sees that city blueprint, and he follows the city blueprint, and that's just his manifestation. So he's got his computer for prayers, and he's got this city blueprint. And God says, like, he's like, the plan is really important, and I'll show you how it works. And so Bruce is like, okay, cool, there's a plan, and how come people can pray and change things? And God's like, well, the plan has many ways of being like carried out. Sometimes a prayer can be answered, and that would still adhere to the plan. It'll just change it in a different way, but the outcome is the same. So it's much more complicated than just like A to B. It's more like A to, quantum Z. So it's like it's way more complicated than just that. So Bruce is like, okay, fine. So Bruce looks at it and he's like, so what happened to the rec center? And it turns out that the rec center was no good. Just couldn't be on the plan. Couldn't happen. And Bruce is like, well, this is dumb. And he starts to look at other parts, and he finds out that Grace is actually going to be killed in a car accident in 2 years. And that's not changeable, non-negotiable. Because if that happens, then certain effects of that happening will like change the whole outcome of how like Bruce sees things. And the reason God's like, this has to happen because this is what keeps you on track. It's you might know that I exist, but that doesn't mean you necessarily like believe in the plan, right? You believe in the infallible God. This tragedy in your life helps you find meaning in life in God. It's all part of my plan. And Bruce is like, yeah, but I'm literally talking to you right now. How can I not believe in your power? You've given me the power. How can I not like? And God says, well, this is just a taste of power. Doesn't mean you have faith in my ability. And Bruce is like, I guess that makes sense. You know what? I guess that makes sense. And then he goes, except no, it doesn't at all. And then Bruce starts to change the world as God. He basically is like, I'm going to bring people who are embezzling charity gonna bring them to justice with the power of God, and maybe he just smites them for fun because that would be comedic. And then he starts giving out like inspiration to a dude who cures cancer so that they can now have a cure for cancer. And he changes the plan to stop Grace from dying. It's selfish, but then he's like, well, I don't want her to die. And then he's like, but then these things that are going to happen, like because she doesn't die, then other people have to die. Like there's got to be cause and effect. And he's like, man, this is really, really hard. I don't know how to deal with this. Oh, wait, yes, I do. Mm-hmm. I'll just make it so that doesn't happen anymore because I can do that because I'm God. And so he just makes it so that doesn't happen. And God shows up again and he's like, dude, you broke all of the rules. And Bruce is like, yeah, but the world's a better place. There's less suffering. And God is like, well, you can't cause paradoxes. The whole universe will collapse. Like not like the apocalypse, like reckoning, like the universe will literally collapse on itself because of the logical contradiction. And Bruce is like, you're just mad because it turns out I'm better at being God than you. Like I cause less suffering in the world. I make it so the world is a better place. And God's like, but there's the logical contradictions can't happen. It just can't. And Bruce is like, fuck you, and basically makes it so there's no longer any suffering in the universe. But this also causes a logical paradox in the universe, and the universe starts to collapse, and God is all smug and he's like, how are you gonna fix this one? And Bruce is like, shit, wait a second, I'm God, don't collapse. And the universe doesn't collapse. And God is like, what did you do? And Bruce is like, well, if you had the power to create the universe, then you had the power to sustain it. And God is like, but the paradoxes, what about the paradoxes? And Bruce is like, yeah, they're still there, I just made it so that the universe can run on logical paradoxes because it causes less suffering. Like they can just happen because I'm God. I can do anything. I just made it so that people don't suffer and there are paradoxes. And so
that's great.
So like I don't want the world to be a terrible place. It doesn't need to be logical. It just needs to not be full of suffering.
Exactly.
So yeah. So then God gets like super pissed and Bruce is like, yeah, I'm just a better God because and the whole reason you want people to like go through this thing is you wanted me to be like, oh, God's job is so hard and I need to have faith in him because this is how you keep control. The whole point of faith is so that you don't have to work harder at your job. You can just continue to let people think that you're in control when you're really doing a terrible job. And then if people think you're in control, they don't ask questions about why the world is a terrible place full of suffering. And yeah, so it's like you have the power to stop all this, but you choose not to, which means you're not like a real benevolent God. You're just an asshole. And Bruce is like, well, we like, and basically God is like, well, I'm taking my power back then. And he tries to pull the power out of Bruce. And Bruce is like, well, I'm God, so no. And all of a sudden what winds up happening is because God is God and Bruce is also God, it creates two omnisciences. So now there's like two infinite powers in the universe. One is God and one is Bruce. And basically they like sitting at each other, and anytime Bruce tries to do something, God is basically like no, and anytime Bruce tries to do something, or anytime God tries to do something, Bruce is like no. So they just float there for all of eternity because they can't stop each other. So then what happens?
So good. Oh, keeps going. Okay.
Oh yeah. So then what happens is they float there for all eternity, and then Bruce goes, well, this sucks because we can't do anything. Right? Like neither of us can do anything. So God's like, Bruce is like, tell you what, I will acquiesce my power. I'll give all my power up and you can be the one only God as long as you don't change anything that I did and you let the world be like a better place. And God is like, well, sure, I'll agree to that. And then Bruce is like, what, if you change your mind after we agree to it, I'll know. Because right now in this moment, I am all of time and space. We just float for eternity. So I can know right now if you change your mind. Even after we make the deal, right? Because he can just. So God is like, shit, that's right. Like, if I change my mind even afterwards, Bruce, even though he's not God, he's still God of all time right now, which means he can see whether or not he'll know whether or not I do it or not. So he's like, well, I'm stuck in a bind. I either float in eternity with God, or I'm with Bruce, or I make a decision to like do what Bruce wants, and then I can go back to being God. And I have no way of undoing it. So he agrees to it, and Bruce goes back to live with Grace, who doesn't die in a car accident. And Grace see how the world is changed for the better, and is like, see, Bruce, there must be a God. And Bruce is like, oh, there's definitely a God, but he's an asshole. And that's the end of the movie.
I love it. Oh, that's awesome. That's so funny. Yeah,
it's
great.
I think we both had this like cynical idea of like the natural paradox that exists within God. Like he cannot be loving and all powerful. It just doesn't make sense with how the universe works. Like there's just too much contradiction in that statement. And certainly I said like God can exist within paradoxes, sure, but then the universe would have many more paradoxes in it. It cannot be logical and paradoxical at the same time.
Yeah, exactly. It was fun to see how we both sort of took a similar starting point and went. They were similar, but they went different directions. But I liked that idea of basically God going like, yeah, but there's paradoxes, and then Bruce going, yeah, but you're God. You just make it work.
You just make it work, right? You, God himself, is literally a paradox. So clearly, you're okay with it on some level.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I thought that was great. Yeah. No, well done. That was fun.
Yeah. These were some really fun. I don't know if so. My problem is I didn't do anything with grace. Like I think both of our pitches were like, let's get to some heady spaces in terms of like how we approach like this theme of God and whether God is like a good or bad guy or like what his powers are. We wanted to get to that point, and I think what winds up happening is we want to wind up with these really interesting like pitches and stories, but we don't really pay attention to like the cinematography or like scripting of the movie so much as we just want to like tell heady stories about God.
Yeah.
So I don't know if mine would make a good movie, but it would certainly be an interesting story.
Yeah, I feel like both of ours, where you could do it as like a web comic or like a mini graphic novel, where you could kind of get away. It'd be a bit shorter, but you could kind of just lean on the humor to sustain it a little, like the absurd humor to sustain it a little bit more.
Because I still think we run into the same problem of this movie in terms of like we really only have two key players, which is Bruce and God. And as a movie, I don't think that quite functions quite well enough. So I think your idea of like if it was a short film about these two characters, or even like a graphic novel or something like that, where we could just like see how these two key players interact with one another, but the rest of the characters really don't really even matter. They're inconsequential. Probably more so in our stories than in the actual movie.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. As you were doing your pitch, I was thinking like, I am gonna be accused of blasphemy.
Why?
You're gonna take me out and stone me.
Oh yeah. Where any last minute thoughts about Bruce Almighty?
I think I had more fun talking about this than I did watching it. Not to say that I didn't find it funny. I actually enjoyed watching it, but I think I enjoyed laughing about like our ideas about the movie more.
Oh, our pitches were so funny. I was dying in your pitch, and you clearly enjoyed mine when it came to just like how absurd it was that God can't just be like, yeah, there are paradoxes, but fuck it.
I loved that. I thought that was amazing. Yeah. No, I had a good laugh over that.
Yeah, it was a good one. Where can people find you?
My website, www.nathanieldraper.com, or letterboxed at DraperNate.
You can find my band Robot Philosopher anywhere you listen to dope music. We have some music videos by Nate himself. You should definitely check that out up on YouTube. You can also check out our other channel, the CineMasters, for more scripted content, and stick around for lots of great episodes of this podcast right here. There's a lot of classic and new episodes coming out every week. Thanks for chilling with us.
Yeah, thanks for listening.
Peace.